your host, Carmilla, and this is Cat Scratch Radio, a horror podcast. Today we have author of Brat Outta Hell and the upcoming release, Curse of the Were-Poodle, Paul Lubaczewski.
Lubaczewski.
Lubaczewski. I'm just going to leave that in there for everybody to see that I can't pronounce things. How are you today?
I'm doing good.
Hey, so today we want to talk about horror comedy, correct?
Yes.
So what is horror comedy exactly?
Well, at its base, it's a solid mix of both genres, both horror and comedy. It can be slapstick. Jeff Strand writes really good slapstick. It could be more cerebral comedy. I mean, I've borrowed a lot from Monty Python in my career. And in films, I mean, it's as soon as there was horror comedy. Maybe even before, if you count the early Malaise stuff, which definitely played hard for laughs.
Oh, definitely. One of the very first horror movies was a silent film that was actually it's like The Haunted Castle, I believe is what it's called, and
Yeah,
it's just slapstick horror. It's very silly.
that and like even in the what we consider like the early classic films, there's always a little bit of comic relief. I mean, there's bits in Dracula. There's bits. I mean, Bride of Frankenstein has quite a bit of comedy slipped in there.
What made you decide to write horror comedy of all things?
Well, I tell people it's like you have to be deeply in love with both genres or it doesn't work. And when I was a kid growing up, like there was in Philadelphia where I grew up, there was a boom in horror. I mean, every Saturday we had Creature Double Feature, we had Doctor Shock, like so we had like two choices of different films to watch every Saturday. And our parents just thinking, well, it's 2 o'clock on a Saturday, can't be running anything bad then. Would just let us watch it, and it's like, well, actually, they were running Hammer horror films, so it was like blood galore. And then on top of it, like the stand-up boom really started in the 70s, so it was like two of the things I loved very deeply. And then then you see other authors like Pratchett with fantasy and Douglas Adams with sci-fi prove that like you can go cross genres, and the more stuffy and the more rules there are about a genre, the easier it is to be funny.
That is totally fair. I like that answer. So, how do you personally balance the horror aspect with your comedy when you're writing?
As a general rule of thumb, I tend to keep the comedy flowing, but then there are scenes in the book where it just goes straight into horror and sticks there. There's usually at least one or two good scenes per novel that this is just pure horror. Like if I pulled that scene out of the book and dropped it into one of my horror novels, it would fit in with no problems.
What is one of your favorite scenes that you've ever written?
Well, as far as horror, it's actually from Cult of the Gator God. There's a scene where the villain, well, the over villain, as it were, shows up, and there's a mother and her daughter, and they don't see what's behind her, but everybody else. But it's the scene is done from someone else's point of view watching it, and so she's watching these two about to be devoured, and it's a brutal scene, but it worked really well in the book.
Very cool. Do you ever worry that the humor is going to dismiss any of the seriousness of your horror?
I think that really, I guess it depends on how you write. What I mean by that is if you make the humor aspects relatable, like stuff that people can see themselves in, then it's not that far or hard to go over to the comedy part. Like, I mean, to the horror part. It's like where if you're just cracking jokes and you're not making relatable characters, then you could probably lose the ride really quickly that way. But as long as the characters are relatable and the story is relatable, even if it's funny, you still have people seeing themselves in your characters. So like when you turn the horror on, they're still relating to the people you're populating your book with, maybe even more so because just a minute ago everything was ha ha funny and now it's really not. And if the shift, if you do it well, it's watching a really relatable person, somebody you'd like to hang out with, suddenly going into this really horrific situation, which if anything makes it that much worse.
Yeah, I can see that. Uh, so what do you think of parody horror movies like Scary Movie?
um Good for one viewing only if they're done well.
That's a good response.
They're not. I don't want to like bag on what anybody does, but like you watch something like Scary Movie, and it's like there's a couple of decent jokes in there. It's a solid time killer. You never need to see it again.
Yeah, I can see that.
At the
So,
same time, you can flip around like a film that's done just what I was saying with relatable characters, and it turns up the horror, if anything. Like Shaun of the Dead, the characters are totally relatable.
mhm.
They're people you can see, and it makes the jokes land and it makes the horror land that much better because you're into the people, you're invested. You've become invested in the character and how they do, and so anything that happens past that, you have a much more realistic reaction to it.
So what's one of your favorite horror comedy movies or books?
Um, Movies, I'm always going to go with Young Frankenstein,
Oh,
just
good choice.
because the love, again, what I said, you got to kind of love both genres.
Hmm.
The love and care that was put into that, the obvious fact that they adored, especially Bride of Frankenstein. It's so obvious in the movie because I mean the details are just so perfect and everything is just done with such attention to detail that you can feel that they're not making they're not mocking. They're having a joke. And
Yeah.
there's a real difference. Like if you can see, it when you see it between somebody mocking something and somebody going, that's actually kind of funny there. And the difference is really noticeable. And there's again, you can feel in Young Frankenstein, they really, really adored what their source material for it. So that's always a favorite as a film. Um, God, I read a lot of horror comedy because it's the genre I write in. So, always want to pay attention to what everybody else is doing. I love the Christopher Moore's You Suck trilogy is really good, or his vampire trilogy. I really liked Married with Zombies by Jesse Peterson. And Jeff Strand is probably the only author I know that can do slapstick because slapstick is such a visual medium
Hmm.
that when it's written, it tends to fall flat. And Jeff's stuff it surprisingly doesn't. I think it's because he's also got like some quick quips in there and stuff and also believable characters that invest you a little more. But like I think out of everybody I've seen try to do some form of slapstick in writing, his is the only stuff that actually lands.
See that? That sounds really. I haven't read any of those books. I'd have to write them down and look into them. I just started reading horror comedy recently. I got introduced to it through another author that I know that wrote the series Ghost Punch, which is about a girl who can punch ghosts. And it's really good. I love the use of like puns and like trying to laugh off your traumas and stuff like that. But yeah, I feel like it's really relatable because a lot of people use humor to deflect.
Well, that's I'm when I was on the horror comedy panel for Stoker last year, and that's one of the things I pointed out. It's like, well, what are the two ways we deal with trauma? We either laugh or cry.
Yeah.
I mean, those are our two go-tos as people. And so, like, you either have the trauma of horror, or well, it's really close to wanting to crack a joke. And I think in every group, there's always somebody in a horrible situation that cracks a joke. And hi, I am that person.
I am too.
No matter what happens in life, there's always a funny aspect to it. It's just, and if anything, I think it lessens the blow of everything to just crack a joke. If you can, it kind of reduces it. It doesn't like we have a tendency as people to like blow things up and blow things up in our head, and they get bigger and bigger and worse and worse. And if you crack a joke, you kind of shrink it back down a little bit again.
Yeah, it's like humbling the situation.
It's Stranger in a Strange Land has a bit about laughing. It's like the main character, the man from Mars, can't understand humor and can't understand laughter for like the entire book, and then he finally gets it. It's like it's not a good thing in and of itself. It's our reaction to a bad thing to make it better.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. I know it's something that I do regularly to cope with traumas or anything bad that happens. Like, if I don't laugh at it, then I'm going to be crying. So I'd rather laugh at it.
Absolutely. I'm Polish, and gallows humor is, well, that's something we specialize in. And if your country was right between Germany and Russia, you'd specialize in gallows humor too.
You know what? That is definitely fair. I can see that. So how do you implement comedy into your horror? What do you do specifically?
Um, I tend to be a very like I guess there's different schools of thought on writing comedy. I tend to go I tend to go through for the Monty Python quick-witted, like I guess it all goes back to the Marx Brothers, like the argument between the Marx Brothers and the Three Stooges. And I was always on Team Marx Brothers. So I try to put like just quick-witted lines, observations, and that actually I think in a way not only does it make you laugh, but it also makes the lead character relatable if he's pointing out something funny in life that, well, if you look at it, yeah, it is funny. Like one of my favorite comments to make is, about the supermarket checkout line. It's like, if you look at the tabloids, everybody's always valiantly fighting on their deathbed. None of these rich people are like, happily in Jamaica right now. I want to read that headline in the Inquirer for once.
That's true. I think a lot of news is very much shock value. The more horrible it is, the more like more people will look into it. And I literally just did an interview on true crime with another author, and I was talking about the fascination of true crime and how obsessed we are. And I almost wonder if the way our news media pushes it on us has anything to reflect on that.
I think also, I mean, it's part of what makes horror so successful is it takes the darkest things and turns it into escapism. I mean, horror is its own fantasy. It's a different genre. It's escapism in and of itself, and it's kind of a way of laughing at the dark. And I wonder if like our fascination with true crime is as long as it happens over there. Like it's fascinating over there. If it happened in my neighborhood, then less fascinating.
Yeah, then
But
it's terrifying.
yeah, but then it's like it's our way of like knowing that stuff is out there, but kind of again reducing it somewhat by turning it into like true crime and something to obsess over rather than what it really is, which is like, a very terrifying few minutes.
Yeah, definitely. So what got you into writing horror comedy?
Well, um, I think seeing other authors like hit their genres, and it's just like, horror's always been like my favorite genre of film or reading, and it's like watching other authors do the same to their genres just made me think, horror, like I've been reading horror since I was reading Poe when I was a little kid, and there's a lot to gently poke fun at. And if anything, I think like the juxtaposition makes it easier to get laughs or at the same time like take a happy scene and like really go with it into nasty. And it's like I was watching, like, when I was a teenager, the Hitchhiker's Guide hit really big. um so there's sci-fi, and then there's like Terry Pratchett, like just did fantasy, and then John Scalzi has also done sci-fi, and it was like, well, why not go after my own sacred cow and go for horror? I mean, I also write a lot of horror, but I definitely have more fun when I'm writing horror comedy.
You know, I would suspect that you would. It comes with the territory. So,
I think you get, because you humanize the characters to be able to tell jokes, you get into the characters, and that makes it easier to flow.
yeah,
Like,
I call it my funky flow when I'm writing, and I get kind of into that zone.
yeah, and it's like, because I've humanized them with cracking jokes and stuff, it's like I'm really into these characters, and then like it's just easier to get into the flow. I mean, it's like I enjoy writing horror, but as often as not, the characters are so doomed and I already know it that I try to almost keep my mental distance from them.
That, yeah, I've made myself cry by killing off some of my characters before. I'm very sensitive about that, but sometimes I think that you kind of have to, no cheers in the author,
Oh
no
my
cheers in the reader.
Oh my God, I reread one of my books recently because I decided that I had an idea for a sequel. So I sat down and read it, as took bought a copy, like, regular copy, sat down and read it in bed before I went to bed as a reader. And in this case, a character does die in it, and I was just, oh my God, I was beside myself, sitting there in bed going, oh my God, why would I do this? Why did I kill that character? I'm an a-hole.
Yeah, I read one of my friend's horror novels and I got really attached to a side character and I was regretful forever after that.
Yeah, like I said, I don't really go back and read a lot of my stuff. Like I kind of have been lately, but in this case, it's because I had an idea for a sequel, and I really wanted to find my headspace again for that book. Because every book has its own headspace and its own flow, and to get back into that exact kind of flow that I was in for that book, I figured the best way to do it is just reread the first one,
Yeah.
and then on top of it, I had a Brad Out of Hell has an Audible, and I just never gotten around to listening to it all the way through, and which is a shame because I mean the narrator is great. It's Morgan C. Jones, who starred in Boys from County Hell and Game of Thrones, is the narrator, and it's just I just time.
Mm.
But I've been doing a lot of driving lately, so I listened to that, and it's like it's actually kind of gratifying. It's nice to be reminded that like I actually can write and I do know what I'm doing, because there's plenty of time as a writer to just sit there and go, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a fraud.
I think we all go through that with every book. Every time we're writing something new, it's like we've forgotten how to write completely, even though we just finished a novel.
My big one is I'm always convinced I'm never going to be as funny as the last book.
You're not going to be able to outdo yourself.
Yeah, I like, and like, yeah, I joked about it after I read Witches, and I'm like, well, I've convinced myself I at one point did know how to write. Now I've also convinced myself I will never be that funny again, and I don't know why I'm doing this.
So when it comes to horror and horror comedy, where do you think it's going in the next 5 years?
Horror comedy is is a difficult one to call, because right now the big houses, like, they know they need somebody who writes horror comedy, but they don't recognize horror comedy.
Hmm.
So they tend to put out a lot of stuff that's soft horror, and there's nothing wrong with soft horror, and I'm not saying there is, but they put out stuff that is soft horror, and it's not horror comedy. It's like, if if the average Sean and Maguire encrypted book makes you chuckle more than the quote unquote horror comedy, it's not horror comedy. It's soft horror. And I keep waiting for the big houses to just start signing authors that are like can legit write that genre, and they keep putting out soft horror and calling it horror comedy. I mean, who knows? Sooner or later, it might get through to them, and it's like, wow, you know what? We sold more copies when it was John Dies in the End than we did with, not going to hit anybody, but, any of these other books, and because that's why they're looking for those books and those authors. They want another John Dies at the End or Christopher Moore. I mean, he sold a ton of books, but they're not signing authors like David Wong or Christopher Moore. They're signing people. They're signing books that are. I mean, they're nice enough soft horror books, but they're really not funny.
Hmm.
You know. And horror right now, horror is going through um a big splatter boom right now. And I have to say that's fine because I've got a book coming that's full splatter that's under a pseudonym because I do have fans and I don't want to drop that on them. Um, and I think it all comes around. I think Gothic will have another swing probably at some point, probably some point soon because like we've gone way out there with splatter and eventually there's going to be like only so far it can go or people will get bored with it and then it'll swing to something else. And it's been a while since it's been Gothic, so I that would be my guess.
So with the coming up soon, what do you think of the new Thanksgiving movie?
I don't know what to think.
I
I mean,
I, I don't either.
Eli Roth is such a hit or miss director with me. Um, like I again, he's just such a hit or miss director with me, and it's like which Eli Roth shows up. I really liked oh Cabin in the Woods. I liked Green Inferno. I know a lot of people didn't, but I liked it because I took it as the homage it was meant to be. It's an homage to those Italian cannibal films from the late 70s and the early 80s, and I watched all of those when I was a teenager because they were the nastiest things you could possibly get your hands on. Um, and but then again, like I never really enjoyed Hostel. I
Fair.
I
Me
I,
either.
I thought it was so by the numbers, like, and I just didn't care about anybody in it.
Yeah, my biggest problem with Hostel was that they didn't develop any of the characters and it was torture for torture's sake.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's like the generic teen horror movie characters. You have like, everybody like just kind of fit their role, and that's as far as we went. We got to know them as like interchangeable with a dozen other cheap horror film characters, and never got to know anything about them, and then just did stuff to them for a while.
Yeah. So I have to ask, obligatory, what is your favorite scary movie and why?
Yeah, and I never have a good answer for that. I think I mean, well, part of it is I don't really get frightened by films. I think it's probably because, well, Creature Double Feature and Hammer films when I was 8. Um, when you're an 8-year old and you watch Peter Cushing get his arm lopped off in Island of the Damned, well, it sort of sets a standard. Um, but I will say, a film I will always love because it was the last film that really, really scared me, and now, mind you, I was dying, was Dracula Prince of Darkness. And there's an opening sequence where um, the one character is suckered down into the basement to be like the newly resurrected Dracula's first meal, and that scene scared the hell out of me when I was a kid. And since then, I've always had a deep-seated love of that film. And
Uh,
it's Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, and how can you go
yeah,
wrong there?
true. I've always loved the Dracula movies in general. I think they do a really good job with the horror elements when it comes to Dracula movies. The Nicolas Cage movie about Dracula that came out, I can't remember what it's called. It's a horror
Renfield,
comedy. Renfield, that's right. Have you seen that one?
yeah,
What did you think?
yeah,
Because I liked it, but like I probably wouldn't watch it again.
I liked it. I didn't love it. The horror comedy from last year that I loved was Cocaine Bear.
Yes, Cocaine Bear was an excellent addition to the horror comedy list, I think.
Yeah, the very first Funko I've ever bought in my life was the bear with the leg.
Well, everybody's got to start their Funko collection somewhere.
Yeah, now I'm moving on to a Mad Max trio. They have a Lord Humongous and a Wez from Road Warrior Funko. So, well, I want them.
Yeah, I have the entire collection of the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies pop Funko Pops.
That's a funny book in that it works really well as a film. I
Yeah,
liked
oh
the
yeah.
film. The book, it's like the joke doesn't it's a fine joke to carry a movie with, but
Hmm.
a book is so much longer, and it takes so much more time to read,
Hmm.
and the joke didn't seem to hold up as long.
Yeah, no, I think the movie, very few movies are better than the book, but I definitely felt the movie was better than the book in this case.
Yeah, every once in a while, like I almost always I note them because it's rare that the book isn't vastly superior. Like I always point out the ruins, just because in the ruins you should have it figured out within 100 pages what's going to happen, but it's a 440 page book, so that's 300 and some odd pages of torture porn.
Oof.
But in a film that's like an hour and a half, well,
Mhm.
that idea lasts plenty of time for an hour and a half.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Uh, it explains why a lot of horror translates well to movies.
What especially explains why a lot of horror novellas can be made into movies, because you don't need that huge series of ideas to carry a film the way you do a book. So, if you've got a 30,000 word novella, you've actually got probably more than enough plot to carry a film.
Yeah, for sure. When it comes to books, what are three books that you would recommend that people start with horror comedy?
Um, well, any one of the Vampire Trio by Christopher Moore. I personally like You Suck. Um, Wolf Hunt by Jeff Strand. That's a definite. Especially his, like I said, he's the only guy I really see that makes slapstick work. Um, yeah, I'd probably go Married with Zombies by Jesse Peterson. I mean,
Married
there's
with
a
Zombies.
yeah, she wrote this great horror comedy series, and then she quit to go write romance. And that's not the only time somebody who really had a great feel for horror comedy like stopped writing it. Jim McDaniel wrote a book called The Unattractive Vampire, and it's hilarious, and it's really well paced, and it's got good character development. And then he's never written another book.
Huh, that's
Yeah,
really interesting. Because I guess there is the truth to that some people only have one book in them.
it must be, because I mean he was a great book, and I used to follow him on Twitter, and he like works on play scripts, and hasn't even so much as suggest that there might be another book coming.
Oh, wow. So, wrapping up here, where can my listeners find you online?
Well, Facebook is usually the easiest place, especially with what's happened with what used to be called Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I honestly, the only reason I still have a Twitter is because my son likes to DM me.
That's
So I
fair.
mean, and Blue Sky doesn't have DMs yet. So, but yeah, Amazon, like most of my books are for sale pretty much so everywhere. I like, Barnes and Noble has a bunch of my books. So does Books a Million, and overseas same. But yeah, Facebook, I've got my author page, and I've got my personal page, and I usually friend people through in my personal page. And I do have a website, but honestly, you can get most of the stuff that goes on the website You can get that first from my Facebook page because I update them all at the same time.
And if they're going to read your books, which one would you suggest they start with?
Well, probably the upcoming Curse of the Werepoodle, which is coming out next month. But other than that, it's I think it depends on what region you're from. If you're from the Appalachian region or the South, the Wild Witches of West Bygod. If you're from the North, because that's set in West Virginia. And if you're from the Northeast, probably I Never Eat Cheesesteak, which is set in Philly, and it's been described as the most Philly book ever. So I'm like originally from Philadelphia, and I've lived the last 18 years in West Virginia.
Very cool. Thank you so much for coming on Cat Scratch Radio. I've had a really great time listening to you tell me all about horror comedy. I learned some things that I had no idea about, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, of course. You've been listening to Cat Scratch Radio, a horror podcast with your host, Carmilla Mays, also known as Matu C. Lawrence. If you want to find me on social media, just look up MX Carmilla.